The 16th Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome. Now it is time to begin the choice of Korean Peninsula in the process of world order reorganization. And let me introduce the chairman of the session, Dr. Lee is working in Keio University majoring political science, and I will hand over the microphone. Thank you very much for the introduction. This session, we will going to talk about Korea's choice in the paradigm shift in Jeju's investment, attraction and strategy and policies moving forward. And I will going to start the presentation and discussion right away. Let me introduce the speakers and panelists. Today we have 2 speakers and 6 panelists. There will be one break in between. The first speaker is Orlando Wilson from George Mason University. And the panelist there is Ballard Salentai. And next we have Professor Kim Young-jun. And next, researcher Seo Bo-hyuk from KINU. Now let's have Professor Wilson on the stage, and he will going to talk about the untapped potential of the Korean Peninsula, challenges and opportunities from conflict analysis and resolution perspective. The speaker will have about 10 minutes, and panelists will have 5 minutes each.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's a great event already. We see it's full of dynamic people from a variety of backgrounds, and of course, it's good to be here and to be able to present to everybody today. So as you see from the title of my slide, it's Untapped Potential of the Korean Peninsula, the challenges and opportunities from my discipline, conflict analysis resolution discipline. So this is the agenda that we're going to talk about today, and I'll try to be brief in some points, and then we have room for discussion at the end of the presentation. So recognition is always needed, and in fact, this is a great recognition to have. We're at a great location in Jeju. We're surrounded by great people, intelligent, very good intellectuals, and of course, a great respect for all of them. And of course, a great thank you for Dr. Pak and KINU and all the great team that invited us here today. And of course, most of all, everybody that's joining us from on TV and here locally. I think it's important to hear and see all of you out there. So the purpose of this presentation, of course, is to talk about the conflict analysis resolution perspective and how we're going to deal with challenges and opportunities within both the country and the region. And to do that, we're going to look at such things as the transfer of these challenges to engagement opportunities for peaceful coexistence, integration, which I believe is paramount in order to have eventual unification on the Korean Peninsula. Also, we need to look at how the Korean Peninsula can become and expand its partnerships in the region and become both a regional and global leader. When I woke up this morning, I woke up in Incheon, where I live right now, and I wanted to just to make a comment that tomorrow is going to be 72 years since the beginning of the Korean War. And ironically, living in Incheon, I know that Incheon was probably the most dynamic part of the war that changed the outcome of the war. And then we're here at a peace conference, a very renowned peace conference at a peace island, talking about how to make better peace. So I think it's only ironic that tomorrow is the 72nd anniversary of the Korean War. So as you can see from the background, again, this untapped potential of the Korean Peninsula, the challenges and opportunities for the conflict analysis resolution perspective. And what I mean by that is that if we're going to bring South Korea and North Korea, the Korean Peninsula, into the role of regional and possibly even global leaders, then we have to understand this as a symbiotic relationship. In other words, that you can't really have one without the other. It's very difficult to have it without the other. This all comes down to choices that we have as we try to support any type of peace processes, and of course, any type of support we have in working with North and South Korea to become the leadership and the roles that we want them to have as a leader. Also, when I talk about challenges and the untapped potential of Korea. There's a lot of untapped potential. If we look at South Korea and the Korean War in general, South Korea at the end of the war was extremely poor. It had little, and look at it here today. It went from an OECD receiver to a giver, and depending on the index, from the 10th to 12th largest economy, GDP in the world right now. So they did a great job, and ironic to say that they did so with nothing. South Korea didn't have any infrastructure at the time. They had very few factories. They were all built in North Korea during the Japanese occupation years. South Korea didn't have any raw materials, didn't have enough technology, wealth, highly educated society at the time. But they did this through the backbones of hard work and labor that they did here to Korea. So that untapped potential is retapping into what they've already done in the past, I think, at a greater level. So, as we know at the macro level, if we look at the region in general, especially Northeast Asia, we know that COVID-19 has pretty much put the world into a mini ice age, to include East Asia and Northeast Asia itself. Ironically, though, the South Korea and Taiwan and others has really fared well, and I think that goes to show the leadership and the skills they have within the region. I believe at the end of this pandemic, there's going to be a rush in order to have a surge of growth, both regionally. Within South Korea, we already see that. I think a report just came out the other day. GDP ambitions up to 4%, I believe, or 4 or 5% for this year. And I think there's a great growth to have in South Korea. So we see all this happening. But we also see the world being complicated with aspects of leftover globalization, and the ugliness of not knowing your neighbor or not wanting to know your neighbor, prejudices, different forms of nationalism, and accompanying militarism, not just within the region, but also globally, that threatens the prosperity of the region and, of course, all the countries within the world. This also directs, of course, the stability of the world as well. So a challenge and opportunity. Of course, there's going to be future threats, pandemic threats that we see here today. We see a thirst, search for energy, raw materials, and control of the seas, concerns over rising sea levels, climate change and pollution that we have all around the world, competition over fisheries and other resources, and challenges within the region specifically is the historical and territorial conflicts that remain unresolved from the past. Such things as the territorial and historical conflicts between, of course, Japan and Korea, China and Korea, Japan and China, and of course Russia and Japan, just to name a few. So, more specific on these historical conflicts and why they're important to us now today is that these remnants of what we have in the past, this historical division, thoughts of the past, threatens our future. Threatens our future in a way that if we don't begin to look at it, we're going to have continued problems thinking about the past instead of going forward. Now, don't get me wrong, history is important and we shouldn't overlook history or deny it. But we can certainly learn from history and learn to be partners in the world today. Also, you have the remnants of colonial imperialism within the region that threatens the future of what the countries within the region wants to do. So, what do we do? If we continue to not do anything, of course, these past conflicts, along with the current conflicts, micro conflicts and mini conflicts within the region, has the potential to become violent and to have further division within the region. So what do we need to do differently, maybe? Well, we need to confront the realism, the militarism, rather, that's taking place within the region. We see almost all countries within the region raising their military spending and increasing their provocative actions within the region, threatening other nations. We also see larger nations outside the region and within the region trying to have the ability to tell the smaller states what to do or who to be with. In other words, a form of bandwagoning. There's an expression in Korea, of course, a shrimp between whales, and I think this goes fitting for different countries within the region. The smaller countries feel the pressure from larger neighbors and, of course, superpowers that want them to go within a certain direction. Additionally, nuclear weapons continue to be an issue, not just with North Korea. North Korea, I think, is a very small part of it. We also see ambitions to increase nuclear weapons with Russia, China, and even the United States. And also we see large countries threatening others or interfering with others, such as what's happening in Myanmar today. So at the micro level, though, getting back to North Korea and South Korea itself, the Korean Peninsula, in order to have success in the region, we have to think about the status quo. We know that in different lights, the South Korea, the United States, and others have been working on the conflict with North Korea for many years. But we really haven't been able to break through with the right path for this type of relationship to blossom as it should be today. And I believe if we don't do so within the next 3 to 5 years, we may be beyond the point of trying to look at some type of greater relationship with North Korea and eventually probably unification. So this deep-rooted or protracted social conflict, as we call it, has been there for a long time. As I said, 72 years since the start of the war. If you go back another 2 years, when North and South Korea was officially divided and presidents were elected or installed, we see it's been going along for a long time. So with this deepening resistance, we see what's called autistic hostility, meaning that North Korea and others within the region, they don't talk to another for a long period of time. So therefore, their positions and how they think about the other becomes very hardened and very negative. So what do we need to do things to try to change that? We need to try to change that at all levels of society. Also, we need to look at, we need to understand that hard power and doing negotiations at the state level doesn't always get the job done. We need to understand that when parties are in this frozen conflict with one another and they have this autistic hostility, we need to do more than just have summits and negotiations. So if we look at it, we want to change things. We need to think of doing dynamic efforts at all levels of society in order to move forward and to have a better relationship with them in the future. We do that through engagement at all levels of society and use a multiplex, complex in general. And I need to close out because we're running out of time, but I would add that for South Korea has what's called the New Village movement that they've used in the past. I think combined with the concerns with green climate, pollution, the rising sea levels, and the need to have more efficient cities, that they can take this and roll it into a more modern model that helps countries within the region and shows their leadership within the region. That will then help with their leadership on the greater stage. So with that, I will end from here, and I look forward to more discussion later.
Thank you very much, Professor Wilson. We should have given you enough time, but since we have lots of panelists and speakers, I will give you additional time to answer, okay? And then after COVID-19, you have explained the challenges and opportunities and those factors. And let's hear from the panelists about your presentation. The panelists will get 5 minutes each. We will have Professor Tang from Korea University.
Raised some very important questions, and one I would like to particularly emphasize that the full potential of Korea really cannot develop as long as the country is in this kind of very paradoxical situation, that a country which is absolutely and very strongly interested in integrating into the broader region, Northeast Asia, and also the global community, it is partly prevented from this integration by being the other half of the country, which is the North Korean part, almost totally cut off the world. Because if South Korea wants to participate in some broader Northeast Asian logistical integration, to carry out some transport corridor linking South Korea with Europe through Russia or with China, each time it is kind of stopped by North Korea's non-cooperation, passive or active non-cooperation. And as long as North Korea is not cooperating, also South Korea is not able to realize its full potential. So this is a very important point and very clearly demonstrates that as long as this nuclear problem persists, and as long as the two Koreas are having this kind of zero-sum problem with each other, then South Korea is also always remains kind of hindered. At the same time, Dr. Wilson also very correctly pointed out that this is not only an inter-Korean problem. The whole region as such is very much torn apart by all kind of crisscrossing conflicts between China and Japan, Japan and South Korea, China and Taiwan, all that. So definitely the Korean problem is part of a bigger one, and then one problem just very often gets kind of interlocked with the other issues. To mention, for example, if China is unhappy that the US is supplying Taiwan with military equipment, then China is retaliating by not cooperating with the US in the North Korean issue, or something like this. So it's definitely true that as long as these kind of problems persist, then it's extremely difficult to make progress in the North Korean program and back and forth. So it's very much true. The point when I feel a need to somehow look into these matters a bit more closely is at the kind of element of the talk which I feel a sort of benevolent admonition to the local states, and please like each other more, please try to overcome history, a bit like detached. But we need to keep in mind that it's not only the local states having problems with each other. The US is part of the game. It's a paradox because the US is such a powerful actor in this game that by acting and by not acting, both ways can influence the situation. If the US is increasing its military involvement with THAAD, for example, or giving security guarantees to Japan with regard to the Senkaku Islands, then there is a reaction from China. If the US is kind of scaling back its commitment or gives South Korea more latitude in extending the range of missiles, for example, then there is also a reaction from Japan, from South Korea, from China, from North Korea. So whatever the US does or does not, it always influences the situation. We cannot say that the US is just nicely telling countries, please love each other and things like that. And in fact, this is the next point when I feel a need for being more concrete and specific, that when we encourage the local states to cooperate with each other to resolve their problems, how exactly to be done and which states should try to cooperate with each other in which way, it very much matters. Because one form can be very much in opposition to another form of cooperation. In the kind of long-term tradition of US foreign policy, the most important approach was to encourage South Korea and Taiwan to resolve their differences, to cooperate with each other, to reconcile. And sometimes this worked and sometimes it did not. But from a US perspective, it was evidently beneficial to have the two allies having a cordial relationship with each other. However, from the perspective of North Korea or China, this is a kind of very negative scenario. They absolutely don't like the idea of Japan playing an active role in Korean security policies. They would like to keep it out. So from a Chinese perspective, it would be a better formula, better scenario, instead of a bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea, to have a kind of triangle. China, Japan, South Korea cooperating with each other. But the paradox again, if this is being done, then the US feels a kind of uneasy, and especially North Korea feels being neglected and sidelined. So it's very difficult to implement which way is possible. So many times it happens that there are two equally difficult alternatives to bring together maybe 2 or 3 countries in a closer cooperation which may alienate some others, or try to bring together more than 2 or 3, but then it is based on the lowest common denominator and it's not very effective. They don't have much problem with each other, but still the cooperation is not very powerful. So the last point I would like to make here, and then I probably need to finish, that if we try to kind of educate local countries how to behave, sometimes there is a temptation to bring in the European Union as a kind of positive example. Look, if they could do it, if the French, the West Germans could reconcile with each other, how good it is. Try to do it the same way. Very much true. However, the most important point here, they reconciled because they had a common enemy, because of the Soviet threat. So if there is no common enemy, it's much more difficult to reconcile. In the case of China and Japan, who is the common enemy? In the case of North Korea and South Korea, who is the common enemy? So it's very difficult to find a concrete and specific form, but still we should look for it, because just trying a sort of general formula and telling everybody that be nice to each other, it's good, but it's difficult to implement in practice. So thanks a lot.
네, 자른타이 교수님.
Thank you for the great comment, Professor Zalon Chai. So we could hear a lot of elements about challenges that we have in the East Asian regions. So with the cases from the European nations. So based on that, we could think about the direction for the Korea. And next, we're gonna hear the comments from Youngjun Kim.
Had a very interesting conversation before this session. So, and that was very interesting, and I had a lot of thoughts about the conversation we had. So I would like to pick up where we left off from that conversation and pick Dr. Wilson's brain on the issue that a lot of Korean experts and Korean observers have been struggling with, which is a sanction on North Korea. For those of you who are not a part of the conversation we had earlier, what we discussed is that Dr. Wilson talked about his presentation topic, and I told him that I generally agree with a multilateral approach to North Korea and to the peace building in Korean Peninsula. And I also said that it's necessary to have forward-looking attitude and future-centered vision to be able to move away from the current status quo of the Korean Peninsula. So in that, we have the same idea about how to change and move forward from where we are now. But the question is that to be able to implement what Dr. Wilson suggested, the macro level approach and micro level approach and multilateral process, there are certain conditions need to be satisfied, and that one of them is the sanction. So the sanctions has basically have two purposes. One is obviously to punish the troublemaker, the targeted country, and the second purpose is to satisfy the domestic audience of the actor who is imposing the sanction. if you look at how the sanctions are played in the international arena, sanctions are usually imposed by democratic countries on non-democratic countries. In the case of Korean Peninsula, the North Korea is the authoritarian country, has been imposed on sanctions, and United States is the driving force. The reason, well, we discussed about the effectiveness of the sanctions, and I agree with Dr. Wilson that the sanctions itself did not accomplish what it was designed to accomplish, and there's no question about it. But the problem is the second part of the purpose of the sanctions. So the democratic leaders have to answer their domestic audiences on the questions like, what are we doing to mitigate the threat comes from North Korea? And the second question, another question would be, why are we not punishing or even compensating for the bad behavior if we remove or not sanctioning the North Korean regime? So those questions make policymakers difficult to remove or easing sanctions. So that's the question a lot of, like I said, Korean experts and observers have been struggling with what to do with the sanction when we absolutely know that it's not effective. So I would like to ask you your suggestions on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Professor Kim just mentioned about the effectiveness of sanctions on North Korea. So next, we're gonna have comment from Professor Seo.
윌슨 선생님의 발표.
The presentation of Professor Wilson showed the reality of Northeast Asia and Korean Peninsula, and you have came up with various practical resolution, and it was very useful for us, and it was macro and micro approach, and you have touched upon this very useful way, and it was very helpful for us. So short and mid-term target and long-term target, if we want to approach in that, and discussing the role of Korea, I think the researcher of Korea should have the responsibility before they try to speak. And about the change and opportunity, you have mentioned many challenges and factors. Some of them can be seen in reality. They can acknowledge this, or they can create another opportunity for exit. And also, as one of the opportunity factor, the US-China conflict is one of them, and hegemony war and political war can be mentioned, but there are some of the possibility that it is not. Opportunity factor, such as the global factor, we need to cooperate. And even though the framework between the US and China, both countries are trying to maintain the current order, and they have common need in this respect. And if we think about the situation in Korean Peninsula after Pyeongchang Olympic in 2018, peace process had been stopped. But however, both countries are not criticizing each other that much. And Kim Jong-un regime had not given up nuclear program, but he is still attempting to have economic development, and that aspect is showing as the opportunity factor. And after Biden administration came in, Korea and the US said that they were going to approach North Korea with dialogue. And I think we should really look this carefully. And with the conflict transition effort, global for Northeast Asia and for Korea and North Korea. In terms of Northeast Asia, there are many factors of conflict historically. I think in order to resolve this, we need to have private institutions involved, and with the climate change restoration, Millennium Development Goals should become a very good material for the cooperation in between. We can make this as a research item. This also applies to Korea and North Korea. You have mentioned three-dimensional peace building framework, and you have mentioned about the mid-level and the upper level, but I think grassroots level is also important. So in order to make peace building sustainable and stable, we need public participation, and public needs to be benefit from this peace building. Mr. Chairperson, do I have 27 seconds left? Can I do more? For peace in Korean Peninsula, Korean people needs to have responsibility. I will add more. We need to have short-term challenge and mid and long-term challenge, and we need to connect this. Yes, your sanction mentioning was very appropriate. I know that President Biden have mentioned about having a dialogue with North Korea, but in that process, he did not mention anything about the environment. He only mentioned about human rights, but people's lives, North Korean people's lives. We need to lift sanction in terms of improving the people's lives in North Korea. But without having those measures, I am very skeptical if the US is actually willing to have a dialogue with North Korea. They are still keeping their system divided, but they are not willing to give up anything. So I think we should really point this out. Dignity of public lives of people. So quality peace and peace in Korean Peninsula, military aspect, non-military aspect, these had been mentioned. But in the passive peace, I think people can still live in a safe environment with dignity. And if we think about this more carefully, we can resolve the issue. The framework that only focusing on the North Korean nuclear program, I think this is not appropriate. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, thank you for the great comments, Professor Kim. So three panelists just delivered a number of comments and the various backgrounds and the various contexts, and I felt it was really interesting. So for numerous topics, Professor Wilson will make a short comments about like 5 minutes. So if we still have time after that, we can have more discussions with our panelists here. Please, Wilson, Professor Wilson.
Well, to comment on all this in 5 minutes is pretty difficult. I think each of these questions and comments are conferences in themselves, or at least papers to write. But all great comments. I think I'll go to the last one first from Dr. Soul, because it hits on some of the other ones. The one comment struck me very closely was that about nuclear weapons and our singular focus on nuclear weapons in North Korea. I understand the reason. We are worried of rogue nations having nuclear weapons. However, nuclear weapons, countries has had them all around the world, and fortunately, they haven't been used yet. Does that make it easier or better to have them? No, absolutely. We shouldn't have any nuclear weapons. But we shouldn't be focusing on just nuclear weapons. I used a comment, we had a conversation at lunch about, and I use this often, about treating the symptom instead of treating the disease. And of course, the disease, when it comes to North Korea, is not their disease country, but the conflict itself, the deep roots of the conflict. And it's not about nuclear weapons. By looking at only nuclear weapons, we're lessening the fact that there's deep-rooted reasons why there's still a division. So why look at just nuclear weapons? Well, from an international perspective, it's easier. It's something they can reach out and touch, but it doesn't resolve the issue. And I think that you're absolutely right. We shouldn't focus on just nuclear weapons. In fact, nuclear weapons should be one of that long-term, you talked about long-term goals. I think the long-term goal should be to get rid of nuclear weapons, or at least a midterm goal. Right away, we need to do more immediate things to try to engage with North Korea and to try to make them a better responsible country and to work with them in various levels of society. Sanctions. Sanctions was mentioned by you, Dr. Zoll, and also the next door here. And I think it's important to talk about sanctions just for a moment. And is that sanctions were never created to be long-term. Sanctions are good for short-term effects, as in the case of South Africa back during apartheid. But sanctions, there's been various sanctions on North Korea since the beginning of the Korean War. Whether it be tariffs, whether it be blockades, all part of the sanction regime. North Korea has been very resilient about going around sanctions and surviving until today. How many experts, I use the word loosely, has said every time that there was a famine or every time there was a leadership change, that North Korea would collapse? Well, they're still here today. Sanctions obviously doesn't work. It hasn't stopped them from having nuclear weapons or long-range missiles. We need to deep further in that. So I believe that we should re-look at sanctions altogether, not as a negotiation tool to say, we'll remove sanctions if you talk, if you give us something, but as a responsible nation that should be more worried about the human rights and the living conditions in North Korea. With the North Koreans, we have to look at the effects of sanctions on the North Korean people, because it certainly isn't affecting this North Korean government. So if we're going to look at trying to help the North Korean people on human rights issues, and we need to relieve the sanctions in order for the North Korean people to start to get some relief from those sanctions. And then we can look at other things in a step-by-step building block manner. But it's hard to do when sanctions are in place. It's hard to do when people want to negotiate instead of have relationships. We need to create relationships at all levels of society in North Korea and with other countries around the world in order to start to move in the right direction. You're absolutely right. The MDGs are very important. I think they can be used as a building block. When I talked about earlier, we didn't have a lot of time, but to use, the MDGs are great pointing directions to go in. And they can certainly be incorporated into the talent and know-how and the ambitions that South Korean government has to become a better nation as well. So I think MDGs are the right way to go in that respect. Both of you gentlemen spoke about China and the U.S. In fact, all three. It's interesting because the China and the U.S. is in a cat and mouse game. We know that, of course, but also China and the United States has a relationship. Economics. The world is driven by economics, and I think that China and the United States knows that at the end of the day, if we don't have trade, if we don't have economics with the two countries, then the world is going to be in chaos. So I don't think that it's the end game by saying that you have to be on China's side or U.S. side, or China and U.S. is going to make the day or not make the day. I think that responsible nations have the ability to work in their own dynamics and to work in combination to make a better lives for themselves and better lives within the region. In the U.S. perspective, I don't think the United States would be upset if South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, or other countries in the region actually had more dialogue, did more things together, worked on partnerships. From the United States point of view, and this is from a personal and also a professional point of view, there's nothing wrong with that. China's point of view, they may look differently, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be angry at it. If it's done in the right process, it's done for peaceful means, then certainly I don't think China will so much push off against it. We all have, each country has their internal factors to deal with, and I think it's very important. Going back to the first discussion, he made some great points that I wish that we had an hour to discuss about many of the stuff. But when it talks about the problems with security and how to deal with the sovereign states, each state recognized by the United Nations and recognized by all members are sovereign states. That includes North Korea. We shouldn't tell North Korea how to behave outside of being a responsible nation with their own people and human rights. But the same with other countries in the world. We should help them or maybe have discussions with them, but it's up to them to make the changes they need. We cannot change another country. The people within that country needs to make that changes within themselves. The last point I want to make is about education. I didn't have time to discuss it, but as we know that when it comes to state relations, especially with democracies and non-democracies, it's basically always at the top level. We need to have multi-level efforts, and that includes education. Not only educating the people, but educating the experts on what's going on within the regions. Because I think that the more educated we become, the more wise we become, and that can filter down into better relationships in the future. As far as the U.S. domestic audience and sanctions, U.S. domestic audience, I think, is blind or unaware of what sanctions are when it comes to North Korea and what they may or may not do, to be honest. We have other things to worry about like every other country does. I think, though, that sanctions can be looked at, and the U.S. population would not say anything about it. Much more to say, but thank you, gentlemen, for all the great comments you had.
네,
Thank you, Professor Wilson. I'd like to give more time for all the experts and the speakers and the panelists, but we are proceeding this session in two different parts, so we need to move to the part 2. I feel sorry for all the panelists and the speakers for not giving enough time. So actually, we mentioned before, we have a lot of agendas to be discussed in the future. So I'm going to make a promise for all of you. We'd like to have a separate session and invite all the participants here to have more discussion, more in-depth discussions. We can stream our discussions via YouTube, and a lot of people can share the ideas. I will promise to have opportunity like that. So the part 1 was focused on the traditional security. And part 2 will focus on the new security, which is called the non-traditional security. And on top of that, we can talk about the opportunities, not only our challenges. So we can have precious time again. So again, I'd like to say thank you for Professor Wilson and 3 panelists. So after having a short break, about 2 minutes, we will start the second session. So we will continue our discussion again. Thank you very much.
네, 그럼 두 번째 파트 시작하겠습니다.
Next, we have the second session, and after COVID-19, we want to touch upon the change of the world reorganization after COVID-19, and we would like to talk about Korea's strategic choice. And Korea and the US, North and South Korea, they are maybe they might start talking again.
As wearing all the masks, we are still under the COVID-19 pandemic. However, fortunately, we are seeing a hint of resolving the COVID-19 pandemic. So for session 2, we have 1 speaker and 3 panelists. So for the speaker, we invite Dr. Unju Park from the Korean Institute for National Unification. We also have three panelists. First, Professor Hyungjung Park from Konkuk University. And second panelist is In-Chul Moon, a research fellow from Seoul Institute. And for the third panelist, we invite Hyun-Suk research professor from the University of North Korean Studies. For part 2, we will give the same amount of time in order to prevent complaint from the participant of the first session. So first of all, Dr. Park will have a presentation about 10 minutes, around 10 minutes. And then, under the theme of World Order Reorganization after COVID-19 and the Korea's strategic choice. And after hearing the presentation, we will have comments from three panelists about 5 minutes each. So let's invite Dr. Park.
Good afternoon. I am Pagan Zhu from KINU. Today, I want to talk about World Order Organization after COVID-19 and Korea's strategic choice. If you look at the subject, it seems like a big concept, and how we can find the strategic solution, we have not find the answer yet, but this is very much connected to the research subject that I am going on. So by the end of this year, I hope I can collect the opinions of the experts, and then I hope I can come up with the bigger picture. So first of all, this is the agenda. There are 4 agendas. I know the chairperson had mentioned this. After COVID-19 had first started in 2019, December, all of us thought it will end soon, like swine flu. When it became pandemic, people were very scared, but it was gone after few months when we found a solution. So when COVID-19 started, after a year and a half, all of us thought that we will not be wearing masks anymore. We thought we would have a meeting without mask, conference without mask, but still we are wearing masks and we are having meetings online. And COVID-19 had given a very big concern to all different countries. COVID-19 is making our life difficult, but is it actually affecting the world order? Maybe you can be skeptical with this. COVID-19 had made shutdowns, social distancing, wearing masks, and this had brought an economic downturn. And demand contradicted, supply chain disrupted, and the mask that we're wearing is causing the environment pollution. Some of us thought the COVID-19 is helping the environment because there is no industrial activity, but after COVID-19 prolonged, we get lots of delivery foods and we wore more masks, so this is worsening the environment. Some of the things that we thought that it might help the earth to recover, but now it is reversed. It is actually attacking the earth. So more and more COVID-19 prolonged. This is bringing crisis to society and economy, and we need to focus on this. Airplane, ships, they are in a standby state, so cessation of climate monitoring data collection is also a big problem. There are some limitations just by monitoring through the tower. So for Korea, climate change, we are not experiencing climate change that much, but South Asia, they are experiencing lots of climate change. For those countries, they are facing more difficulties and crisis, and this can be a very negative effect that they might face. There are many drivers that are affecting the change of the world order, but what will be most in risk if the world order change? It is instability. Because of that instability, world order change should be focused on. Professor Wilson pointed out that about the traditional security, national independence, and territorial independence. This is not damaging anything about the land or the territory, but some of the things that had not been mentioned, which is the human security, has become a big issue now. Currently, in 20th century, traditional security was the world order, but in 21st century, non-traditional issue, new security issue will play a big role in organizing world order. Currently, the base of the world order is maintaining Westphalian international system. At the end, this Westphalian system and other worldviews will have a conflict, and how much and how will it going to affect, and this will going to have a huge impact on world order. And the Chinese concept, the rise of China had made we mention about G2, but this inside the framework of competition between US and China, this is showing a direct conflict, and this is actually shaking the world order. In that situation, when we talk about world order, we talk about the strategic conflict between US and China, but I want to talk about what happened in 2000. For the last 20 years, SARS, swine flu, Ebola virus, COVID-19, this new infectious disease, we really should look into it. Bill Gates said that health security will be a big issue. For the last 20 years, infectious disease had cost us about 864 trillion won. This is much higher than we thought. And not just focusing on disease or problems that are making people's lives hard, this is actually affecting the existence of a nation. So after COVID-19, how will the world order change? And I've thought about this very deeply. Some say it will change completely, and others say the existing system will accelerate. We don't know which way it will go. And if I predict the new order, because of COVID-19 have spread, we cannot go back to the lives that we used to live in. And all the nations are wanting the new order to settle. And so far, G2, China and US, their leadership had disappeared, and we all witnessed that. So the control of China or the US, we are deviating from it. We are protesting it, and this game had started. The second path will be different from the infectious disease in the past. This is also very temporary. So we know that vaccines or medicine will be prepared someday. And these measures will be only a short-term measure. So all this confusion will go away and this will go back to the normal. And this chaos will become temporary. So at the end, Korea will have to choose. Korea will have to think about what kind of threat that they're facing. Does Korea should change or does Korea should maintain what they used to be? Based on their choice, the future of Korean Peninsula will change. In what way? How will Korea going to set the relationship with North Korea? And how will Korea will maintain their relationship with the neighboring country? Ultimately, old order will going to disappear and new order will take its place. And we will going to have a strategic space in between. And unlike before, the status of Korea is higher than before. So how we can manage to use this infrastructure and instability of North Korea's region was not that huge before, but it is very huge right now. And this can be the opportunity, but also a crisis. And about the crisis issue, Korean Peninsula can be another stage for the conflict in between the big countries. We know that we are in a very close relationship with China economically, and if we have to choose, and what we choose will going to determine the destiny of Korea, and how are we going to accept this? When Japan becomes our strategic threat, how are we going to defend it? We really need to consider this. The conclusion is very hopeful. International order, whether it changes or not, what is very important is that Korea cannot live alone. In the past, we used to have cooperation in between alliance countries, but now we have to think about the geological-based cooperation. And for East Asia, there are so many conflicts and confrontation in this area. So through this regional cooperation, we need to have idea to have a regional cooperation. So how are we going to find the rebalancing strategy? This rebalancing strategy should be made by the expertise discussion and forums. And third, destructive innovation, global decarbonization, untapped culture, and also technology-based new attempts are possible now. This destructive attempts will going to help Korea to raise its status or help us to find a rebalancing strategy. And this is the end of my proposal. Thank you very much.
So the world order reorganization and the post-COVID era, we can have a lot of opinions for that topic. And for that regard, we could hear a summary of Dr. Bach's opinions. And I believe that our panelists will have different opinions on their own. So, focus on the public health and security. So there are some elements for the cooperation that South Korea can provide. So I'd like to hear if there is any like element for cooperation in the future from the panelists. And actually, the regional cooperation in East Asia is not nothing new. It has been existed from the past. But at the moment, when we have a chance to do the reorganize the world order, we can think of the possible like options or the potential for the regional cooperation, and I think it is worthwhile to think about it. So, firstly, we'd like to have comment from the Professor Park. So, good afternoon, everyone. I am Hyungjin Park from Konkun University, and I had it was a great presentation from Dr. Park, and I believe it was really helpful and useful information. And today, I'd like to talk about the strategic choice of South Korea. So what should be our direction for the future strategy? And that will be my focus for my discussion today. So just before, we could see 3 different cases. The regional cooperation was the first one. So I'd like to specify and to provide concrete ideas on the regional cooperation. So currently, North Korea is always struggling itself. So after the post-Cold War, like from 1990s, so even us, we are struggling with the difficult times with the introduction of the Moon Jae-in administration, and now we're proceeding with the strategy under the peace and the prosperity on the Korean Peninsula, and that's the for the peace for the prosperity, we are pursuing the new southern policy and new northern policy. And in that regard, we can think about it. Of course, now we are having we are facing difficulties from COVID-19 pandemic and the changes on the world global regime. But we have to continue our strategy on our peace and prosperity topics. Actually, my preamble was quite long, but current changes on the Northeast Asia, we can assume that there are changes. And actually, Dr. Park explained this really well. And we could see the new security threat in the region and the new recession in the economy. So all this like new changes and the shifts in economy will be a very important factor for us to decide the future strategy. And on top of that, there was the 8th convention party of the North Korea's Labor Party, and they insisted they will pursue tit-for-tat strategy. And there's no advancement between South Korea and North Korea, and it is causing a lot of difficulties on the domestic policy diplomacy with the North Korea. And given the introduction of the Northeast Asia era, now we are entering a very great and significant change. So the Moon Jae-in administration's opinion and the post-COVID era and the end of his presidency. So it is really hard to see smooth operations in the proceeding of his strategies, but the value and the contents of the strategy should be reconsidered and reviewed. That's my opinion. So it should be the Northeast Asia plus responsible cooperation, as well as the strategy and the action plans should be suggested. And I'd like to suggest my own opinion, and it was the key contents of my discussion today. So for the responsible cooperation in the Northeast Asia, the key content will be the cooperation will be made focused on the regions. So regional bilateral relationships should be strengthened, and also we have to diversify the diplomatic relationship to build the strengthened relations. And all in all, we can create a platform for the regional cooperation. And for the peace, we can we can pursue political initiative for the regional And to do so, we will continue the dialogue and the negotiations in the region. So Northeast Asian issues is limited to the North Korean issues and the nuclear problems of the North Korean issues. So that's why we couldn't have discussions and the dialogues on various dialogues. So with the Northeast Asian platform, we can diversify our agendas and focusing on the small regions and build trust. And that effort should be made. And so the institutionalization of the cooperation can be the key point of my discussion today. And for the new Southern policy, we can think about the relation with India and strengthen the relation with Asian. And also for new Northern policy, we are now strengthening the relations with Russia regions. So all the promoting strategies and the action plans for this new Northern strategies, we can we can build trust relations with our neighboring countries, and this issue has been continuously raised in every talk. However, this new Northern policy doesn't limit our partners to China and Russia. But it is true that we are limiting our partner to China and Russia, but we have to go beyond. We can expand our partnership to other Eurasian countries. And for the sanctions on the North Korea, based on the sanctions on North Korea, we can pursue phased approach, which means that we have to pursue two-track approach. So first option can be we have to consider the situation when the North Korean talk is not proceeded. So based on the reviews on the other literatures, we could see a hopeful and the optimistic ideas. And most of the literatures are focusing on the optimistic result. However, post-COVID era will usher in a chaotic era. So all the negative elements also should be focused to seek alternatives and solutions. And thirdly is the common diplomacy and the private sectors as well. We can proceed with that at the same time. And for the new Southern policy, I can talk about four elements. So first one would be we have to maintain the consistency of our policies. So for the new Southern policy, now it is focusing on the enterprises. So with the change of the administration, it has saw a lot of halts and suspensions in between. So we have to maintain the consistency. So also we have to multi-layered consultative bodies as well. So this multi-layered consultative body refers to considering the security threats of each Asian country, each Asian member countries has. So we can have mini multilateral consultative body. Also, we should consider countries related with the extended security and the human security. So with those countries, we can create another separate organizations as well, or cooperative organizations as well. So by building those small cooperative organization will be crucial, and also the participatory cooperative organization would be important, because for the Asian talks, high-level talks has been made between China and Japan. So the differentiation of the new Southern policy of the South Korean government is the people and prosperity and peace. So we can take a closer approach on that matter. And lastly, I like to highlight the focus of the ASEAN that we could see recently. And it is quite actively seen in the regional relations. So it is a matter of existence of the member countries inside the ASEAN, and because of that, we also need to first take a closer look on the issues inside the ASEAN and their internal issues, and they will be a key factor to proceed with our new Southern policy. So this is it that I prepared for today's discussion.
Thank you, Professor Park, and we will move on to Dr. Moonin Char. My name is Moonin Char from the Research Institute. Thank you so much, Dr. Park, for your presentation. After I heard the first part of the session, I think it is very much similar with the idea of mine. I don't want to name the country, but I know that you know the country. I don't know if this country had become the bad nation because they own a nuclear weapon, but because they nuclear weapon, they become a bad nation. We don't know which one came first. Because in terms of the world order, this is based on powerhouse. So this is based on the US and the US. Right after the COVID-19 had been declared as pandemic, people started to talk about post-COVID-19. And at that time, when they mentioned post-COVID-19, they had regretted the globalization. And there were some mentioning about anti-globalization, but the core is that advanced countries and powerhouses, they all dominated the world order. There were criticism against globalization, and there were some changes that had been attempted. Post-COVID-19 is strengthening the power again. So the regret of globalization and criticize against globalization was not specific enough. And I don't know if this is the regret against poor globalization or neglecting the labor class or poor country. They are still prioritizing the profit of the advanced countries, and they are still neglecting the rights of the labor class, and they are still vulnerable class, and no one is interested in this issue anymore.
전 포스트 코로나 시대에 대한 논의는
So the discussion of post-COVID-19 seems like it is directing to strengthen the power of the US more and more. And this is very inconvenience truth, which is the rise of China. And after COVID-19, the US is trying to reorganize the world order based on
대내적으로 아시아인 혐오를
the US, and they are utilizing the Asian hate, and they are trying to direct this polarization issue to somewhere else, and they are trying to make another confrontation and conflict, and they are utilizing this conflict to maintain their hegemony. I have written down some of the agendas. I will add more if I have enough time.
Thank you, Dr. Moon. So actually, I'm really popular to make it in time, but I think we have to take turns. Now, interpreters are making the best efforts, and I believe that they're convenient with they're okay with our panelists and discussions. So I'd like to ask Dr. To have a discussion for 5 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hyun-Soo Kim. from research from University of North Korean Studies. First of all, it is a great pleasure for me to participate this session as a panel. So to be first, I'd like to talk about the conclusion of my discussion. So the exclusiveness of the North Korea that it is showing under this pandemic condition can be an answer. So they actually rejected the functional regime, but still they are seeking for the humanitarian support or the food aid. So there's a possibility that we can do to make those kind of humanitarian support even under the situation. So for the dilemma they're facing, we need to focusing on the diplomacy of the North Korea is having at the moment. So from the 8th Convention of the National Labor Party of the North Korea, they issue their rejection for the functional administration, and they stopped all the contact with external countries and environment, so we couldn't get out of the stagnant relation with the North Korea. I believe the failure of the national summit between the U.S. and the North Korea can be the direct trigger. However, the other causes are continuing the stagnant conditions. So there's a limit to draw another new solutions for the North Korea, so they can self-criticize their conditions. So it is not a it is not a traditional security, but we can raise the question: can we consider this as a new security threat or new non-traditional security? But in that regard, the North Korea has always had the anti-sentiment to the global market, which was led by the U.S. And they always thought that they are the worst, they are the least beneficial country under the U.S.-centered economy. So this can be one of the reasons. And still, North Korea is focusing on the traditional security approaches and trying to decrease or to mitigate the gap between the security and their economy. However, the internal conflict is expanding under this condition, but while having no stark or the concrete clear. But under the condition, if the South Korea government keeps asking North Korea to do something or to participate in something, it can have an adverse effect on the North Korean regime. So, and also from the announcement, remark on the 70th anniversary, President Moon Jae-in asked North Korea to go together. However, North Korea can consider this as another threat. However, North Korea is showing their different attitude. They are infusing strong philosophy on their philosophy, as we could see from a lot of press release or the news. So they are trying to control their people and the country, but in reality, they cannot do as they want. And starting from the side effect of the external factors, but they are in the position that they have to ask for help to the foreign countries. So this their exclusiveness can be another hint or can be another key to solve their current situation. So that's my point of my presentation. Thank you for complying with the time. So Dr. Park will make an answer for a number of comments.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to answer. When I was trying to prepare the session and my presentation, I feel so sorry for the chairman because I am very greedy, so I only had 80 minutes for the session. We had so many panelists with me here today, so the chairperson is having very difficult time for running the session. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to answer and ask questions. And I am so happy that we have this 3 panelists here today who are all mentioning about different things. And if I consolidate all those 3 is new Korean Peninsula system and world order change. I don't know how to make this happen. It was very difficult for me to build new Korean peninsula, but today's session was very helpful. Traditional security is not important anymore. I know that new security is important, and Professor had pointed out the things that I have missed. North Korea is facing the crisis of traditional security, and they are about to lose this. Of course, new security threat is very important, but this old traditional threat is very important. So I know that people are trying to start dialogue, and I am also one of the people who are studying about this North Korean issue, but in order to go to the level of peace and prosperity, then the North Korea should understand, they should accept our idea, and I think we should really think about how they will react on this. And thank you very much for pointing this out, Professor And I also very much agree with the strengthening the power back again. And in that process, China's protest and US supporting which country and which country is supporting what order, this will going to affect the new order. Yes, this is a very good idea. Professor Park, you also gave me very impressive idea. You have mentioned about the Northeast Asia. Korean Peninsula still has the Cold War ideology. When we say North, we think Russia and China and North Korea. This is the ideology from an order of division. We still have the process of our ideology and thinking, which is still fixed to Cold War era. So we should escape from the if we escape from the Korean Peninsula, and if we expand the activity to the more wider space, then maybe we can escape from this ideology. And I think it would be much easier for us to think about the measure to fix this. And in that way, maybe we can become more active subject, not a passive subject. So all three panelists have gave me very good opinions, and I will going to accept your ideas and work on my research. Thank you very much.
Because of the time limit, I was not supposed to have my final remarks, but I'd like to make a final comments actually. So we proceeded with today's session into different parts. So we have talked about the world order reorganization and the cooperation factors in the post-COVID era. Of course, we have some factors for the threat, challenges, and opportunities. So we've touched upon various elements, but in practical perspective, we have to understand what kind of different national interests that each country has. And in order to find the answer, we have to promote the exchange and the communication of each countries and between countries. So through dialogues and talks, we have to manage those issues. So finally, so the title itself was the World Order Reorganization. But what I want to know is that if we're gonna hold Jeju Forum in this format, because this is the new norm in the new world order, and this is the new type of the new era. So I'm wondering if this system will be continued or will change. And before wrapping up today's session, I'd like to say thank you so much for all the speakers and panelists of today's session, and the audience from offline and online, and all the interpreters who made their best efforts, and all the other staff and the technicians who have supported today's session. And lastly, I hope health and happiness for all the participants, and all the participants who are here. I'd like to have enjoyed the beautiful nature of Jeju. And thank you for participating in today's session. So once again, please give a big round of applause to the chairperson, speakers, and panelists, and trusts, and all the participants. Thank you very much.